My next duty is to introduce some people that are no strangers to agriculture and agribusiness in North Carolina, and that's Dr. Mike Walden and Dr. Blake Brown. They need very little introduction because of the work they do, and I know that we depend on their economic forecast, and I think they tell the truth. That's a good thing. Mike Walden is a William Neal Reynolds Distinguished Professor of Economics at NC State University. He has teaching, research, and extension responsibilities in the areas of consumer economics, economic outlook, and public policy. He's published 8 books and over 250 articles and reports. Mike directs the semi-annual economic forecast, the North Carolina Economic Outlook. He's won numerous academic and public awards, including the UNC Board of Governors Award for Excellence in Public Service and the Order of the Longleaf Pine.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and thank you again for inviting me. It's always great to be here at the NC State Fairgrounds. In fact, the week of the State Fair is probably my best week of the year. I just thoroughly enjoy it. My job is to give you a broad view of what's happening in the economy. Blake's going to bore into the ag economy specifically. I will say one thing I do that gets a fair amount of publicity is each year I publish a number that shows the value of agriculture and agribusiness. So it's the entire supply chain, if you will, of food, forestry, and natural fiber products. And last year, Commissioner, I believe we were around $90 billion in the state, which is about 17–18% of the entire state economy. The Commissioner teases me periodically and says, you know, Mike, it'd be nice to see that number around 100. So we're working on that, but obviously the numbers are what they are. But that number has been going up. Let me move ahead, and I'm going to fly through some of these slides. And why isn't that going in the direction that we want? Am I doing this right? Where's our tech guy? Oh, there we go. Number of things I want to highlight about the national economy. I want to look at the fact that economic growth, broad economic growth, is continuing. The Federal Reserve, which does affect you if you do anything with the financial services sector, they actually changed course, monitoring. Okay, here we go. Trade wars, Blake, I'm sure is going to talk more specifically about that, but we've had some good news on the trade wars, which have certainly affected you. With a very low unemployment rate, big question now is, are we running out of workers? So I want to address where we might get more workers. The Goldilocks economy, I'll just let that simmer with you. It's a good news thing. Stock market booms. I'm not going to forecast the stock market for you, but I do want to show some trends. And then we do want to look out there and see if there are any ominous situations on the horizon. So these are going to go rather quickly, but you all keep up with the economy, so this should not be an issue. The major metric that we economists look at for a broad view of the economy is something called gross domestic product. Just think of that as an aggregate production number. So it includes what you do, it includes what service people do, it includes what manufacturers do, even includes what Blake and I do somehow at the educational level. So as long as we see, as you're looking at this slide, this number positive, that means we've grown. And in fact, we have now grown for over 10 years. It's been over 10 years since the last recession. That's actually a record. We have never had an economy where we have grown this number of consecutive years. So that's certainly good news. The unemployment rate as a result has gone down. It's gone down to actually slipped under 4%. You can see we're not quite as low as we were in the 1950s. I don't know that we'll get that low, but clearly we've seen an extraordinary improvement in the overall unemployment rate. Now, if you look at a broader measure, that first slide that I showed you is the unemployment rate as conventionally measured by looking at people who don't have jobs, but they have to be looking for a job to be considered unemployed. This slide relaxes that second condition and includes people who are what we call underemployed, but it has also gone down. So good news there. Incomes have gone up on a per capita basis. This is actually adjusted for inflation. So you put all this together, you put together the fact that the job market has been good, people are seeing their wages and their incomes going up. That has made for a strong economy, and in fact, I think those are the two major components of the fact that most people view the economy as a positive right now. Now, some other pluses in the economy, if you look at part-time work, now a lot of people work part-time because they want to, but what we are concerned about often is people who are working part-time because they can't find full-time work. Those folks are finding more full-time work. So we see part-time work, especially for those who want to work part-time, full-time I should say, that is down. If we look at wage gains by different income levels, this is very interesting. I've been doing this now for over 40 years. I've not seen this in previous economic recoveries. Actually, if you look at wage gains, let's say by low-wage people, middle-wage people, high-wage people, the group that has had the fastest wage gains in the last several years have been low-wage workers. So I think most of us would consider that to be good. And then lastly, if you look at who is actually getting the rewards of our economy, is it shareholders? Is it business owners? Is it workers? The share going to workers has actually been going up, and that's actually reversed a trend in the other way that we'd seen for several years. All right, I mentioned the Federal Reserve. This is always an agency that you should keep an eye on, and just to remind you, this is not an agency that is a line department like the Defense Department, the Ag Department, Homeland Security. This is a very unique agency in the sense that it is privately funded by banks. The president does have the power to appoint members of the governing board, but other than that, the president doesn't have direct influence over the Federal Reserve other than through public comments. And this is an agency that has a great deal of influence over how much you pay to borrow money, for example, because they set a key short-term interest rate that really bounces off, other interest rate bounce off of that. Federal Reserve also has a very key role during recessions. We saw that during the so-called Great Recession. So this is a chart that is showing you that level of their key interest rate. And if you probably have to squint a little bit. If you look at the far right-hand side of this chart, what you see is from roughly 2014 through last year, 2019, the Federal Reserve was inching interest rates up. Now they were coming off of the zero level. And most economists thought they were eventually going to take interest rates above zero. You really can't, you don't want to maintain a zero interest rate. And they had gotten interest rates up to, they were edging close to 3%. And then about this time last year, the Federal Reserve changed course. And they actually lowered interest rates last year by just shy of 1%. Now, why did they do that? Well, they had gotten a lot of criticism for their increase in interest rates because one reason that the Federal Reserve increases interest rates is that they want to head off higher inflation. They worry about the economy when it is growing, may potentially growing too fast, which tends to push inflation up. We hadn't seen any signs of rampant inflation, and especially in your sector. So the Federal Reserve listened, and they actually lowered interest rates last year. Right now, we think they're in a position where they're going to keep those interest rates steady. So that was a very, very interesting part of our economy in 2019. Now, the trade wars. Clearly, your sector, agriculture, agribusiness, have been mightily impacted by this. I'm not going to go into the details, but I will say that it looks like we have some thaw here. You may have read that we now have the successor to NAFTA, the USMCA. That was actually agreed to, signed by the three principals. I think there's still one little step to take. The Canadian Parliament has not yet ratified it, and there's some internal politics going on there as a result of the last election in Canada, but it's widely expected they're going to do that. So we are going to have the new USMCA. I'm not going to go into the details here, but I think in general this is good for the economy. It's good for farmers. The option would have been to go back to the pre-NAFTA. And I had estimated that if we did that here in North Carolina, we probably would have lost 50,000 jobs. So most people view this as a positive, and there are two sectors, I think, in our economy here in North Carolina that will be positively impacted. One is your sector, and the second is the auto sector. And the reason the auto sector, and you might say, do we have an auto sector? Yes, we do. We don't have an assembly plant, but we have a big auto parts industry. And one of the two provisions in the new NAFTA, as I call it, are going to impact the auto sector. One is a requirement that Mexican auto workers get paid more money. Their wage is going to go up. And that's going to make, and of course that was an advantage of the auto industry moving facilities to Mexico because wage rates are low. Well, part of this new agreement is that Mexican auto workers are going to have to be paid more. So that's going to reduce the incentive for auto companies to put operations in Mexico. It might even lead to North Carolina eventually getting an auto assembly plant, which is a big, big deal. And the second provision that is helpful here to North Carolina is there was an increase in this agreement of the percentage of parts that go into autos or vehicles assembled in North America that have to come from North America. I think it's going up to about 70% from down in the high 50s or 60s. That should also help the auto parts industry in North Carolina and probably get some more jobs there. Now, the trade war with China has clearly hurt. This is a chart that shows you the drop in exports of agricultural commodities to China. I don't have to tell you this. It's been very, very hurtful to the ag sector. We have seen a thaw, not a complete win, if you will, but a thaw in this trade war in that in mid-December, the President and Vice Premier Wei, I think is the way you pronounce his name, signed an agreement in the White House, what's called a Phase 1 agreement, which will see some reductions in tariffs. Not all tariffs are off, but some tariffs are reduced. No new tariffs. In fact, I think it was on December 15th, if we had not had an agreement, we were going to see another round of new tariffs imposed. So this Phase 1 agreement came just at the nick of time. There's an agreement in this, or there's a provision in this agreement that China is going to agree to significantly increase their purchases of U.S. manufactured products and U.S. agricultural products. So if that is followed through on, that is certainly a good news. Now, there's some issues still to be resolved here, the main one being that companies in China that compete with our companies, whether they're ag companies or non-ag companies, often receive heavy subsidies, heavy help, if you will, from the Chinese government. And we've argued, hey, that's not fair. We don't mind competition, but we want it to be level playing field competition. That difference there has not yet been resolved. And so many think that we're going to, in fact, the White House has said there's going to be further negotiations and eventually a Phase 2 agreement may or may not come before the election. So anyway, good news here, in my view, that trade war, although it still continues, there's been some thaw there. Now, I mentioned unemployment being very, very low and the question, where are we going to get new workers? This is a chart that shows you what's called the labor force participation rate. It simply is a measure of how many, the percentage of people who are working age and aren't disabled, who are in the labor force, either have a job or looking for work. And you can see the big, if you look at the left-hand side of this slide, big jump from the 50s through 2000. That was when women increasingly were moving into the paid labor force. I always want to emphasize that because if you're a person who works at home, whether you're male or female, raising children, managing the household, that is work. It's just not you're paid for it directly. But anyway, we had a large movement for a variety of reasons of women into the paid labor force. That seems to have peaked around 2000. And of course, during the Great Recession, we had a tremendous decline in labor force participation as unemployment ran up. But we've had a little uptick, if you look at the far right-hand side. We're not back to 2000 levels. So I think the question, or the answer to the question, where are we going to get more people to be in the job market because the unemployment rate is so low, is we've got to entice more people or equip more people to be in the workforce. And one of the problems we face is that we do have a fairly significant part of our working age population who are not able to work because, unfortunately, they have addictions. And for example, the opioid addiction has been one that's gotten a lot of attention recently. It's estimated that nationally about 2.4 million individuals of working age can't hold a job because they are addicted to opioids. And if you brought that back down to North Carolina, it would roughly be somewhere around 200,000. So I think this is an area where hopefully we can do some work to bring more people into the labor force. Now, I mentioned the Goldilocks economy. What do I mean by that? I mean by that, for example, when Blake and I were in undergraduate school. Blake, you studied economics in undergraduate school? Okay, yes. So this is, I won't say how many years ago it was for Blake, but it was almost 50 years ago for me that I was in undergraduate school taking my first economics course. One of the things we were taught was that you can't have low unemployment and low inflation at the same time. Policymakers have to choose. Well, for several years now, we've had both at the same time, and it's causing a lot of those writers of textbooks to go back and revise their textbook. So one of the positives that I think, again, the general community, the general consumer is very happy with is that if you look at the chart here on your left, that is the unemployment rate. If you look at the chart on your right, that is the inflation rate. And if you look at the far right on both charts, you can see those numbers are quite low. So that's been a major change. I don't have time to go into why that's happened, but that's been a major positive in the economy. And it has influenced, for example, the Federal Reserve. Because it used to be the Federal Reserve thought, well, when the economy is growing, we've got to raise interest rates in order to snuff out inflation. Now they don't have to worry about inflation. All right, the stock market. Stock market has continued to roar, which one result of that, or one conclusion from that, is that the business community in general is very positive about the American economy. I mean, I remember a professor, again, 50 years ago, telling me or telling the class that, yes, the stock market is a place where you put money and you try to make money, but another implication of the stock market, it's almost a daily vote on how people in the economy feel about the economy. And if the stock market's going up, that means they're optimistic about the economy. If it goes down, that means they're not. Now, we saw that recently with the concerns with the coronavirus. We had a couple days last week where the stock market went way down, 600 points, I think, one day, but we're back. And now this is a day-to-day thing with the coronavirus, but I think there's been an assessment that, yes, that's something we need to be concerned about, but I think as I'm speaking right now, I think the medical community and others think it can be contained. So the stock market reflects even something like that. So the fact that the stock market has been bullish does indicate that, at least in the minds of investors, both small investors and institutional investors, there's a bright outlook for the U.S. economy. And on that note, let me see. No, don't have my forecast yet. All right. Well, before I get to my forecasts, which are positive, by the way, let me talk about what could go wrong to maybe tarnish that optimistic outlook. And there are lots of things that could go wrong. I mean, obviously, the coronavirus could be a lot worse than we thought. We could, if you go back about a month, people were worried we might get in a shooting war in the Middle East with Iran. That, fortunately, did not happen. North Korea is a wild card. So a lot of potential situations out there that could hurt consumer and business confidence. But one that we know historically is something we need to worry about is debt. And so what I'm going to show you are a series of slides that show you, for the major components of our economy, the consumer, the government, and the businesses, how's their debt situation. And the conclusion here, it's actually in good shape. This is a slide that shows you how much the average consumer has to take out of their paycheck to service their debt payments for whatever, student loans, mortgage, auto loan, et cetera. And if you look at the far right-hand side, it is very low. It is very, very low. And in fact, contrast, if you go back a little bit, move away from the far right-hand side, you can see a peak there. That was the peak right before the Great Recession. So one of the problems, or one of the sparks of the Great Recession, is that consumers were up to their eyeballs in debt. That has tailed off. So this is good news. If you look at government debt, this is particularly government debt. Now, we know the government continues to borrow money, and we know that means more money being spent to make interest payments. But again, if you look at that as a percent of the economy, which is what this slide is showing, we're not at record levels here. Now, that is not, do not interpret Walden as saying we don't need to worry about the government debt. We do. But in terms of a trigger, a short-term trigger, for a financial collapse, we don't see it. And then lastly, if you look at business debt, this is the payments that businesses have to make. This would include you. Payments that businesses have to make as a percent of their market value. We're sort of in mid-range territory here, as you can see. We're not the lowest it's ever been. We're not the highest it's ever been. We're sort of in mid-range territory. So if I have any concerns about debt, it's more on the business side, and this is actually where the stock market is tied in, because if we had a collapse in the stock market, that would send this number way up, because the base here is the market value of businesses. But anyway, overall, the economy looks fairly good, and in terms of forecast, I'm going to say the broad economy is going to grow maybe between 2 and 2.5%, which is not bad. The historical average since from the end of World War II to 2000 was 3%. Now we're a little off from that over in the 21st century, but a lot of that is due to the fact that the labor force has been growing more slowly. I do think jobs are going to be added, I think at a slightly slower pace than last year, although tomorrow, the January numbers are going to come out, and there's a lot of anticipation. They may be gigantic, so I may be wrong here, and if I'm wrong, that's a good thing. I do think we'll see a rebound for farming and manufacturing, in part based on the thaw in the trade war. I think the Fed's going to hold interest rates steady. I think inflation's not going to be a problem, but I think we might see a little bit of an uptick in inflation. Recently it's been around 2%. I think it might move higher, but still nothing extraordinary. I'm old enough to remember the 13% inflation of the late 70s and early 80s. I'm not a stock market forecaster, but if forced, I'll say that the stock market this year could range anywhere from losing 10% to gaining 5%. So that covers, I think, all my bases. So, yeah. All right, let me quickly move through some slides on North Carolina. We have been growing, but our GDP, that broad measure of aggregate production, has actually not been as high as at the national level. If you look at the last three values here, in the first quarter we were higher, but in the second and third quarter we weren't. I think that's signs of how the trade war has hurt North Carolina. If you look at a breakdown by sector, you probably can't read the names here, but you're unfortunately in the red area. You're a sector that's actually contracted from 2010 to 2019. I think that's storms, I think that's low prices, I think that's trade war. Also, we've seen a contraction in manufacturing, so hopefully that will turn around. We're gonna count on Blake to tell us that that'll turn around. North Carolina really took a hit during the Great Recession. This is a slide that shows you per capita income adjusted for inflation. We're in red, the nation is in blue. And if you look at the left-hand side when those numbers were going down, what you can see is North Carolina fell more, and our recovery started later. So that means we're still playing catch-up. If you look at the far right-hand side, we've been seeing per capita income go up, but we're not at a level at the national level. So we're still playing catch-up, and I think that's because we were hit much, much harder by the Great Recession. Now, the job market is where we really shine. We almost every year beat the nation in terms of job growth. In 2019, our jobs grew at a 2% rate. It was 1.4% for the nation. We added 94,000 jobs in North Carolina in 2019. That was almost double what we added in 2018. I think this is a big reason why people still come here. We were beginning to get some data on what's called net in-migration, the percentage of people moving into a state versus those moving out. We were number 9 of 50 states in 2019, and preliminary numbers show. So people love to come to North Carolina, and why not? It's a great state. If you look at where the jobs are being created, we've got a situation here. If you look at high-paying jobs, which are on your left, we've had strong job growth in 2019. That's the blue bar. If we look at middle-paying jobs, we did see an increase in middle-paying jobs, but the growth rate was small. and low-paying jobs on your right, that was higher. So what we're seeing here is the fastest growth in jobs is for high-paying jobs, low-paying jobs, not as much in the middle. And we're not alone there. That's been happening nationally. That's related to a lot of big things, big changes going on in the economy. But this is, I think, at the core of the concerns about income inequality. In terms of where the jobs are going, still our metros lead the state. These are job growth rates. Actually, in 2019, Wilmington and Asheville were the top growing in terms of percentage job growth. Raleigh was number 3. Winston and Charlotte were number 4. But if you look, and I'm not sure, I should have highlighted this, but the non-metro, actually you had a job growth rate that was sort of in the middle. So jobs did increase in rural areas, not the fastest, but nevertheless there was an increase, and rural areas were not that much lower than the state average. Left. And one last thing, I do something called a leading economic index for the state. This is an attempt at the state level to do what many do at the national level, and that is to churn through some numbers that we think give us a peek into what's going to happen and form an index from them, and I've been doing this for about 10 years. And if you look at the far right-hand side, you can see the number has been pretty much level. And what that tells me is that whatever the current growth rate is in the state is probably going to continue. Now, one thing, and I think I showed you this last year, you see almost to the far right-hand side a big dip in that index. That was Hurricane Florence. And so we clearly saw the impact of Hurricane Florence on this. But right now, what this indicator is telling us is North Carolina's economy is going to continue to grow, and it's going to continue to grow at about the rate that we have seen.